Over the last year I made 3 videos about 3 classic Final Fantasy games, and if they're still worth playing to this day. Then the plan was to continue those video reviews with the next 3 games in the series, that being 10, 12 and 13. I had experience with those games in the past and was looking forward to revisiting them for the purpose of those videos. However, when I started to think about it, there was always one more game that I never played but probably should have as a fan of the Final Fantasy series. That of course being Final Fantasy IV. It was always that game I kept saying I will eventually get around to playing, and as you can probably tell from the title, I have finally managed to do it. So I ended up playing through the Steam version of Final Fantasy IV from start to finish for the very first time ever, and I'm here to discuss if this game is still worth playing in 2021. Now I know it's 2020 still, but by the time most people see this video, it'll be next year, so just go with it. If you want to hear only my final thoughts on the game, then make sure to skip over to this time right here, where I'm just going to quickly go over everything and summarise my opinions. And remember, these videos aren't exactly to tell you how great the game was for its time, but rather how well it holds up nowadays and if it's still worth investing time into. End of the day, that decision can only be made by you, but I hope to give you enough info to think it over. Also lastly, if you do enjoy the video, I would highly appreciate a like, as it helps out so much, but also these videos do take quite a long time to make, so any support you could provide this channel would be incredible. But anyways, with that out of the way, let's have a look at Final Fantasy IV. So let me know if you've heard this before. Final Fantasy IV does the best job of capturing the spirit of a true Final Fantasy game. It seems like quite a popular thing to say, doesn't it? And after playing it myself, I can easily see why people would have that opinion. It has pretty much everything you would expect from a Final Fantasy game, from interesting and diverse party members, airships and hovercrafts, chocobos, villages, Cid, and of course, crystals. Not only does it have these iconic parts of the series, it also emphasizes them and makes a point out of them, with the crystals being a major one with this game. But let's talk about this game with some structure. So let's start with its story, and don't worry, I won't be spoiling any major late plot points of the game, only the first 4 to 5 hours or so, as I think it's necessary for the purpose of this video. None of it should affect your experience, plus most of the footage used is about the first third of the game, or just some combat. You begin the game as Cecil, a Dark Knight and leader of the Red Wings fleet from Baron, as you're returning from a mission your king sent you on, where you defeated innocent people in order to steal the crystal. Upon returning back, you quickly get introduced to your close friend Kane and your love interest Rosa. Cecil begins to question his king's actions and decisions, which leads to him being stripped of his duties as the commander of the Red Wings, and is instead sent off to slay a dragon and deliver a ring to the village of Mist. But soon after, once you've delivered the ring, you find out that this was in fact a setup to burn the entire village, and as a result of the following events, you and Kane get separated. It's from this point onward we start to see Cecil struggling to accept who he truly is as this Dark Knight, focusing on all the bad he has done and worrying there's no good left inside him. With time, you begin to meet more and more of your new party members, such as Rydia, Edward, Teller, and more, as you then find out about a man named Golbez who has not only taken control of Baron, but is also destroying nations to collect all 4 crystals of the world. It is also during this time that Cecil decides to leave his Dark Knight self behind and become a paladin, who is essentially this game's version of a warrior of light. What follows is a journey of you and your companions trying to stop Golbez from obtaining his goal. I won't go into detail any further than this because I think that should be enough to give you a general idea. The concept of crystals playing such a major role could be one of the main reasons for why so many people consider this game to be representative of a true Final Fantasy tale, as this dates back to the very first game, with his warriors of light travelling the world in search of crystals. But that being said, from that quick explanation of the setup, you might have already noticed that it sounds quite cliche, and that's because it is. Over the 30 plus years since its original release, we have seen this sort of storyline done hundreds if not thousands of times, and some do a way better job of it than others of course. Now this isn't to say it's a bad thing at all, because for what it is, Final Fantasy IV truly excels at its simplicity. In fact, playing it nowadays felt so extremely refreshing, from the amount of over-the-top and complex JRPGs that feel like they have to constantly one-up each other. I'm sure back in the day some of these games' mechanics were really complex, but nowadays it's really easy to understand and you'll be good at it within a few minutes. Also, whilst I'm comparing it to other RPGs, it seems as though every RPG now has to be at least 40 to 60 hours, otherwise it doesn't count. But that was something else I loved about FF4, and that's its story length. It's definitely one of the shorter experiences in the series, especially if you're unaware of a lot of the side content. So if you're a little busy and you're scared of starting another extremely long and drawn out game, don't worry, this is not it. Final Fantasy IV gets straight to the point. You won't find yourself having to do 5 to 10 side objectives just to advance the story a little bit. That being said though, I do have to point out that there are moments when the game moves on a little too quickly. I'm going to use an event that happens about 2 hours into the game, so if you don't want any spoilers at all, I would recommend skipping the next 20 to 30 seconds. So there's a point in the game where we meet Edward, and his lover Anna ends up getting killed in front of his eyes. It's quite an intense scene, so as you can imagine, you then see Edward weeping and crying, but this literally lasts about 10 seconds before Rydia, who is a child, comes over, tells him to stop crying, and that's it. The game simply moves on like nothing ever happened, and you only get one extra little scene about 30 minutes later where her spirit speaks to him. Yes, he does bring her up a few times later on, but at no point is he physically affected. Instead, the game just tells you we're on a time schedule here, and it quickly moves on. And this isn't a one-time thing. In fact, it happens way more than it should. There's a few moments that could have had a way more emotional impact if the game didn't move on so quickly, which is a shame more than anything. But outside of that, there wasn't much I could really complain or be picky about. As I mentioned earlier, Final Fantasy IV is simple, and it excels at that. But in no way does that mean it's boring either. It still manages to offer enough for the player to be intrigued and want to explore as well. You'll travel through many cities and villages and see slight differences between each one of them, whether that's visually or the sort of NPCs you'll be speaking with. There isn't an overwhelming amount of people to talk to in these cities, but that can actually encourage you to speak with everyone because there's not so many to get through, and most of the time you won't regret it. It's a nice and quick 2 to 3 lines of dialogue. You'll find that most of these villages will have an inn, as well as an item and weapons shop, which you'll be using throughout the entire game to get your potions, phoenix downs, new weapons, and all that sort of stuff. It also has some really interesting girls that will swim or dance. Yep, that's dancing. Okay, fine, they twerk. It's not much, but it makes the cities feel alive most of the time, and memorable to an extent. Plus, the game encourages dungeon exploration, rewarding you with items for 100% completing dungeon floors. So even when you're inside one of the biggest locations, I would still recommend seeing all of it, as you might get a pretty good weapon or a pretty good item out of it, like a phoenix down, elixir, or anything of the sort. As for the world map, it's not too big, and with you having access to an airship from an early point of the game, you can explore everything it has to offer pretty quickly. Some of these places you won't have to visit till much later on, and they might be locked off of course, but the player freedom is definitely appreciated. Now, so far, it might be sounding like I have absolutely no faults with the game whatsoever, and even though I can't say there was anything particular to hate on, I can definitely recall some stuff that should be pointed out if you're planning to play this game. Starting with something that seems to be an issue with a lot of these older games, and that's direction, or rather, informing the player of what needs to be done. There were cases during my playthrough where I found myself finishing up a dungeon or cutscene and then just had to figure out exactly what it is that I'm supposed to do next. Now, to be fair, FF4 doesn't struggle with this as much as some other games in the series, like FF7 for example, but there was one particular event that stuck out to me and I just cannot do this video without mentioning it. So at a point in the game, you visit a kingdom regarding the crystal, but soon find out that a dark elf stole it and is hiding away in a cave. You get told which direction the cave is in, so I decided to explore the castle after I returned and just headed out. I soon realized you can only access this cave with a black chocobo, and the only way for you to know that is if you explored beforehand and you heard that black chocobos are capable of flying. Now, luckily for me, I did actually find that out, so I proceeded to the dungeon like normal, cleared it up, got to the boss, and what followed was pretty much slaughter. I soon realized I had no chance against this boss. It killed all of my party members in one hit. This made me assume that of course it's a scripted defeat because there's absolutely no way I could beat this guy. Only to then be kicked out of the main menu just like I would be if I lost any normal encounter. So I was really confused and thought to myself, hold on a minute, did my game just glitch out? So I went in again and the same thing happened again. I get to the boss, he defeats everyone with one hit and I get kicked out of the main menu. Little did I know that you actually had to explore the castle first and encounter a certain person for the scripted event to take place later on. This meant I had to escape the dungeon, head back to the castle, interact with that person, only to then repeat that entire process again. Now what I want to make clear is that the issue here wasn't the time wasted or having to go through enemies again, because if anything it's just grinding, it's going to make me stronger, right? I had no issues with that. But it was the fact that I didn't know I was missing any sort of items, so I started to assume my game bugged out and that I might need to start a completely new save, wasting hours that I've already put in. But there were definitely a few moments throughout my playthrough where I just had to check online to see what's required of me, because I kind of just stood there and went, well, now what? But with that little side story out of the way, I think it's time I tackled the last big portion that I wanted to talk about, and it's the thing you'll be doing most of the time of course, that being the combat. Final Fantasy IV gives you control of 5 party members at once in its active battle system. This for sure brings up the intensity of the battles because you're constantly thinking for 5 unique characters at once. Each member has a pre-assigned job that also gives them unique abilities, such as Rydia being a summoner, Kain having the jump command as a dragoon, Rosa having the pray ability as a white mage, and so on. Everyone's a little bit different. This means no skill trees or anything of the sort that you might be used to with more recent JRPGs, but instead it makes everyone not only unique but serve a different purpose for why they should be in your party and why you might need them at this time. Some are definitely more powerful and useful than others. For example, black magic is a huge part of the combat in this game, but those characters will usually have a lower HP than something like a knight, for example, so the balance is clearly there. As a little tip though, I will say don't get attached to too many characters because you'll constantly have people leave and rejoin again, so definitely level up everyone consistently, don't focus on one guy only. Luckily though, the leveling up system is really good and you'll find that it's actually well balanced out. At no point did I feel like I wasn't earning enough XP to level up at a good speed. It always felt like whatever point of the game I was at, I was getting just the right amount, and I'm not sure of the specifics of how it works, but at least for me, it seemed perfect. As for the actual battle speed, initially I found the game a little bit slow, but then I realised there's actually an option to speed up combat which I would highly recommend, especially once you're more accustomed to the commands and what everyone's good at and what you want to do with each character. I would turn that up because it makes the game go way faster and definitely seem more modern. As for the mobs that you'll be encountering, you'll quickly get used to their strengths and weaknesses, but it's the bosses that will switch up every so often since they have multiple phases, therefore forcing you to apply new tactics. All of this on top of the fact that this specific port of Final Fantasy IV is considered pretty difficult apparently, as it is a DS version of the game, so if you enjoy a challenge, you'll be right at home with this one. And of course, because this is an older game, random encounters are a thing. Personally, I would say they happen a little too often. It can get frustrating at times, especially when you're just walking back and forth, finding your way around. But luckily, the combat is very fun and enjoyable, especially when you've turned up the speed like I said, so even when grinding, I was honestly having a lot of fun. Plus, it's accompanied by some very good battle music, which gets even better whenever it's a boss fight. Personally, I wouldn't say it's an all-time favourite soundtrack for me compared to the other entries in the series, but it does have some standouts, especially with the slower tracks like the Theme of Love. Regardless though, it's a very solid soundtrack, so don't worry, it's just right to get you through the journey. Compared to the other 3 videos I made like this was probably the hardest one to do. Final Fantasy IV is considered a classic amongst the Final Fantasy community. It represents so much of the series and its traits. By today's standards, it doesn't really offer anything mind-blowing, and its story can be pretty predictable, to say the least. When some of the biggest plot twists were being revealed, in the back of my head I just thought, well, I saw that one coming. But despite that, it does so much to a really good level, it's hard to hate on the game. It doesn't overcomplicate things, it knows what it's good at and it stays in its lane. Plus, with the Steam or DS version of the game, new graphics might not look as cool as the original versions, but it brings a visually smoother experience, plus some cutscenes with voice acting, which I was actually surprised by, and in all fairness, they're pretty solid as well. It's a good way to experience a classic in a modernized yet original way. The main cast is very enjoyable, and even though they might not be joking around too much, they definitely aren't boring or stiff to ruin the experience. Plus, a very intriguing and powerful villain to push the plot forward. Again, there's just not much to hate on it. Final Fantasy IV is that game that does so many things to such a good level, but just does not excel at anything specific. It's a really strong, solid entry in the series, and if you're looking for a pure, simple yet fun JRPG, regardless of if you've played many other Final Fantasies or this is your first one, I definitely think it's worth giving a shot. Quickly now, before you click off the video, let me just say a huge thank you for watching, guys. These videos take ages to get done, I'm not gonna lie to you, so your attention and time to watch this means a lot, honestly. If you did enjoy it, maybe consider sharing it with others, and please leave a comment with your opinion on what you thought of the video down below. This was the first worth playing in 2021 video, and it definitely won't be the last. They take a while, but I love making them, and I want to keep this series going. I'm not sure exactly which game I'll do next, but if you have any specific titles for me to cover, just comment it down below. I'm mostly looking to move on to the newer games, it's just a matter of picking which one it is. Make sure to check out these videos for FF7, 8 and 9 if you haven't already, but with all that, I think that is enough talking for one video. Once again, huge thank you to all of you guys, I really appreciate you, and I will see you in the next one. I'm out.